Well, good day, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to what is going to be your final web clinic in this series. And I'm really excited to deliver this one today for the simple reason is that today's session is probably one of the most impactful sessions that you'll go through. Why do I say impactful? Because today's session, if you'll take on the message of today, and by the way, you can start to implement this immediately. It's not like some of the other web clinics that we've gone through where there's processes involved, where there is a whole lot of additional work that you have to do. Because today's session, you can literally start applying from the moment you switch your computer off today. You can take it, you can start to use it, and you can start to get almost instant results. Because today we're going to talk about providing constructive and positive feedback. Also, I must just warn you, just give you the heads up. Today's session is probably the longest one you'll go through. It typically runs about an hour and 15, an hour and 20 minutes. So if you've got an appointment straight after, don't worry about it because it will be up in the Sales Coach Academy and you'll be able to finish. It's a long one, but it's a good one. If you can stay for the whole one, you'll really get a lot of value from today. Folks, as we launch into today's session, I want you to think about something real quickly. When you consider your time in corporate land, over the years, how many performance appraisals have you had? And how many of those performance appraisals have actually been meaningful? And if you think about it, how many of those performance appraisals weren't even worth the paper they were written on and the time that it took to put them together? Now, if you haven't had any to date, then there's a very good chance now that you find yourself in the management seat, you've had to actually deliver performance appraisals. Now, when you think about it, in most organizations, performance appraisal time is generally either every 6 months or once a year. And why do we have performance appraisals in the first place? Well, this is really human resources attempt to institute a process whereby people can actually get feedback on their performance. And in many cases, that's probably the only time that people actually get to find out how well they're doing. And the problem is that with performance appraisals, the feedback time is typically located around the past 4 weeks of behavior that one can remember. So let me give you the bottom line here before we even begin. If we're going to correct behavior, people need immediate feedback. The closer to the event that you can provide them with the feedback, the sooner you get a change in behavior. So today we're going to talk about providing feedback that actually gets traction, that actually gets results. We're going to take a look at what stops us and gets in the way of us delivering feedback, and also what gets in the way of us actually receiving feedback. So today's session is all about how do you get cut through with your message, whether it's to your people, or maybe even whether it's sideways to a peer, or even when it's going upwards to your boss. What are the steps, what are the processes that you need to implement in your communication so that your feedback actually gets traction? So when it comes to delivering feedback, how do you put it out there in such a way that your message is A, meaningful, and B, more importantly, it's a message that changes behavior and lifts performance? So as we dive in today, I want you to think about this for a moment. Why do we actually give feedback? What's the purpose of providing somebody with feedback on their current performance or their current behavior? And if you think about it, the whole purpose of delivering feedback is to improve performance, is to challenge and get a different outcome. And if your feedback isn't currently delivering the result that you want, then again, using the law of cause and effect, we have to peel back what we're currently doing, take a look at our current feedback process model, and go all the way back and figure out why isn't it working? What are we doing that's really not creating the kind of traction that we're looking for? So when you think about why we give feedback, what are the things that we want to change? What's the purpose of us delivering the feedback? What outcomes do we want to improve? Because we know that the whole purpose of providing feedback is to either change a behavior or to reinforce a positive behavior. And if that's really the outcome we're looking for, if that's really why we're putting out the feedback in the first place, then there's certain things we need to make sure we do in order to get that outcome. And that's really what today's session is all about. Okay, so let's just dive straight on in and let me tell you what it is we're going to be covering today. Well, we're going to look at the process of delivering feedback. We're going to be looking at feedback and why we don't deliver feedback very well. And also, as I said earlier, why it's very rarely received well. Also, we're going to take a look at some different feedback models and some general rules to follow to ensure that your feedback hits the mark, that you actually get traction. Because if you're going to invest the time, if you're going to go into an area which, let's face it, holds the potential for conflict, then you better make sure you've got a really strong process that you're following to ensure that you get the outcome, the result that you're looking for. And so from our point of view today, we're going to really be looking at two types of feedback. We're going to firstly be looking at positive feedback, which involves telling people about good performance. So obviously if they're doing a good job, we want to reinforce that. And so the idea here is that really we have to make this feedback timely, specific, as well as frequent. And really, in most cases, typically we don't do a very good job of this. To paraphrase Ken Blanchard, he was the guy that brought us the 1 Minute Manager. And Ken says that as managers, we're very quick to catch people when they're not doing things right. But it's the rare bird that actually catches people in the act of doing the right thing and thereby reinforcing that good, positive behavior. So again, this is a bit like the Pavlovian dog. Ring the bell, the dog starts to salivate. When we give good, positive feedback every time an individual does something right, that starts to induce a positive reinforcement cycle whereby they start to deliver more and more and more of the right things, of those actions that you expect. And then there's the second type of feedback, which when we think of feedback, this is the type of feedback that we typically think of. And it's what we call constructive feedback. So what is constructive feedback? Constructive feedback is when we alert an individual to an area in which his or her performance could improve. And so as you're going to see, the key to constructive feedback is that it's not criticism. It's descriptive in nature. And in fact, constructive feedback should always be directed to the action and not the person. So let me just repeat that because that is pretty profound. Constructive feedback should always be directed to the action and not the individual, not the person. Because obviously when the feedback is directed to the person, this is when they will go into silence or violence. This is when they feel threatened. This is when they feel under attack. So here we want to give them actual descriptive feedback of their behavior. So actual examples as opposed to making it personal. So that when you say to somebody, you have a bad attitude, you're not doing your work properly, or you're always doing A, or you're always doing B, they can only take that personally. What are they supposed to do with that sort of information? And when it becomes personal, this is always when the conversation deteriorates and moves into conflict. Which, by the way, is one of the biggest reasons why we don't deliver constructive feedback in the first place. Because for many of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, truth is we'd rather avoid the conflict. And so really, if you think about it, the challenge for us as managers is, how do we tell the truth? How do we deliver feedback in such a way that we can uphold the integrity of the conversation so that it doesn't deteriorate, so that we don't lose motivation, so that performance doesn't drop, as opposed to really the whole goal of giving the feedback in the first place was to actually get a lift in productivity or a change in behavior. So yeah, the challenge for us is, how do we tell the truth? Because let's face it, not everybody wants to hear the truth, whether it's one of your salespeople or whether it's your boss. Not everybody can handle the truth.
Tim, Colonel Jessup, did you order the Code Red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
And yeah, the fact is, many people don't want to hear the truth. More importantly, often we are not skilled enough to deliver our truth or the way that we perceive things in such a way that it doesn't create conflict. And so therefore, typically what we do is we brush it under the carpet, we avoid tackling the issue, and thus nothing ever changes. Nothing gets resolved. When we look at it carefully, we know that there are really only 5 reasons why we as managers don't deliver feedback, even though we know we should. And the first one is a lack of confidence. So here's my question. If we knew how to deliver accurate feedback, honest feedback, without upsetting the other party, would we deliver the feedback? Now, as I'm sitting here, I know that some of you are sitting there thinking to yourselves, oh no, I don't have a problem giving feedback. All right, well, let me ask you this. Is there someone that you have a challenge, that you have a problem with delivering feedback to? Is there someone out there that you know you have some fear around, looking them straight in the eye and giving them accurate feedback as to your perceptions of what it is they're either doing or not doing? Is there someone out there that you really wouldn't give true feedback to? And so I guess the question is, well, how would you know? Well, here's the thing. If you weren't afraid of the consequences of having that discussion with that individual, of telling them the truth, here's the question. Would you have the discussion? And if your answer is yes, I would, then obviously you must have some element of fear around delivering that message to that particular individual. Now, whatever it is, it's there. Now, the good news is that fear can be overcome, and it can be overcome by improving your competence. Because the fact of the matter is, if we're afraid of the consequence of the discussion, then we just avoid the discussion completely. And so we know that often one of our resistances to delivering the feedback is that, yes, we lack the confidence, but the fact is we actually lack the competence. Because if we knew how to deliver that feedback without creating major eruptions in the relationship, we would do it. How many times have you bit your tongue rather than actually say what you really wanted to say? But you thought better of it because of the consequences that may result as a result of you delivering that message. I guess the bottom line is we're the messenger in the situation, and the truth of the matter is we don't want to be shot for delivering the message. So unfortunately, depending on the circumstances, depending on the individual, we simply sweep it under the carpet and pretend that it doesn't exist. So essentially what we can say is that the second reason for not delivering feedback is that we lack the competence. We just don't know how to deliver it without creating waves, without creating conflict, without disrupting the relationship. And then the third reason why we don't deliver feedback is because, and here's a big one, folks, we lack commitment to the truth. Now, folks, don't get me wrong. This is not to say that you're mistrustful or that you're a liar or we're not truthful. But folks, let's face it, if we truly were totally committed to telling the truth, we'd put ourselves out there and we'd tell it more often. Instead, what we do is we hide behind excuses, and justifications. We rationalize our reasons for not doing so. Folks, the sad truth is that we actually lack the self-esteem required to deliver accurate feedback. It takes courage to tell the truth. It takes self-esteem to deliver the truth. The fact is, for many of us, we actually lack the intestinal fortitude that it really takes to put ourselves out there and deliver accurate feedback. Unfortunately, the problem for the majority of us is that we live in corporate land. And in corporate land, there's a double standard. And the double standard is, yes, we want you to tell the truth, but we actually don't want to hear the truth. Or more importantly, you'll actually get into trouble if you do tell the truth. And so, in fact, when it comes to using candor in organizations, the truth is that it's really not accepted. People play the political game as opposed to playing the truth game. They give lip service to the truth. Hey, I know myself as a sales strategist, as a consultant. I've lost a number of very lucrative contracts because I'm committed to telling the organization the truth, even if they don't want to hear it, because it's my contention that I'm actually being paid to let people know what I see as the truth from an expertise point of view. The problem is, unfortunately, there are many organizations where they don't want to hear the truth. Because hearing the truth means that they've got to look at themselves and make changes, which unfortunately for many organizations, they don't want to do it. They would rather not rock the boat. Folks, I'm telling you, I've sat in on board meetings where senior leaders, senior managers sitting at that table will look the other way rather than point a finger, rather than tell the truth as to what they've seen and put somebody who might be more senior than them in the hot seat. And so the truth is never heard. In corporations, we dance around the truth. The newspapers are filled with stories every day of senior leaders in corporations who find themselves in hot water because they weren't willing to face the facts. They weren't willing to hear the truth. It's a real shame that so many leadership teams around the country are more fearful of losing their job than they are of telling the truth. So when it comes to organizations and them telling the truth, well, they have double standards. Yes, they value the truth, except for when you tell it. Okay, so how many of you have heard of Jack Welch? Well, for those of you who haven't, Jack is regarded as one of the best chief executive officers that was operating during the second half of last century. He was in charge of GE through their growth period, and I guess like all good retiring celebrities, Jack has written a number of books, and in fact his book Winning is actually regarded by many managers as a management Bible. And here's what Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, said about Jack's book. No other management book will ever be needed. Now, whether that's true or not, I guess Warren Buffett might just know a little bit more about what makes a good manager and what doesn't than most of us. That being said, Jack has some really pertinent things to say about candor in the workplace. And I've got an interview with him talking to a group of graduates at Harvard Business College. So let's take a look at what Jack has to say about candor with organizations.
So one of the things in the book that you're quite outspoken about is candor. You say, let me tell you about the biggest dirty little secret in business, that in every culture, in every country, in every society and social class, there's this lack of candor. Now, why is that so important? Why is it so hard? How do you change that?
I think you have to build an organization. It's quite good in a small startup where people are all comfortable with each other. They know what the mission is. They understand the values. They reward the values. And they go after it with a passion. In a bureaucracy, it tends to get more and more subjected to pressures from the side, from the top, from underneath. People are afraid to speak out. And what it does, it slows you down. It really puts gum in the gears, and it really doesn't improve the workplace. People aren't being told what they're doing well and how they can improve. The evaluation processes aren't frequent enough. We get into this, I'm too kind to evaluate my team. This morning I was in San Jose with about 500 executives from startup companies down there and some pretty strong tech companies, Intel and others. And I asked the 400 people, how many people thought they had straightforward relationships in their company with their peers and with their associates? I didn't get 4 hands. 4 hands. That's frightening. It's sort of frightening. That people are sitting in an organization and don't feel that people are laying it on straight and telling you like this. What was your experience?
I was lucky to work for a good company where over time we really developed this honest feedback. But it wasn't that way when I first joined.
It takes real time.
Real leadership and commitment. Yeah.
And you got to reward that value. In the end, you get the behaviors you reward. If you reward candor, if you reward straightforward talk, you will get it. If you, on the other hand, don't do that, you'll get close to the best behavior.
You've also been outspoken not only on candor, but on differentiation. That part of candor is to be honest with people about where they stand, and you're noted for this top 20, middle 70, bottom 10.
Noted is a kind word.
Tell us a little bit more about differentiation, and shouldn't we be a little tougher on student grading, perhaps?
Well, I think you probably differentiate in school, and you recognize who the top students are, and you recognize where the middle is, and you recognize the bottom. The thing that's crazy is, why is grading and differentiation okay in the 4th grade through getting an MBA, but it in no way is applicable to adults? It's nuts. Why you would end up having this false kindness where you don't tell people where they stand until you run into trouble. So my view is, take care of the top 20, and this isn't a permanent thing, it changes all the time, but take that top 20, make them feel loved, hug them, give them cash, give them rewards in the soul and the wallet, do everything for them. That middle 70, show them what they need to do to get in the top 20, and that bottom 10, tell them why they basically should move on. And don't do it in a guillotine job. Have a conversation that goes over a year or so about what their shortfalls are. Tell them they're in the bottom 10. Don't give them a raise of any kind. Don't give them 2-3%, that fake raise that keeps people hanging around. Cut off the salary issue, and then ask them to leave and say, let's over the next several months work together to get you in the right place. That's so much better. In these crazy situations, companies in the valley here, they run into trouble. What do? They're going to cut costs. They're going to have a layoff. They walk into people and they say, look, Joe, Mary, we got to cut you back. We got to take you out. We need to cut costs now. And they say, why us? And they say, well, you weren't that good. And then they say, but we've been here 12 years and nobody ever told us that. That's what happens in this false kindness thing. People get misled, and then if you do it too late in your career, I maintain that not having differentiation is the cruelest form of management. The cruelest thing. If you have responsibility, if you lead people, they should know where they stand.
So that's really the biggest dirty little secret that corporations hide today. Companies hide from the truth. I mean, let's face it, as humans, we have a natural self-preservation instinct. Often when it comes to telling the truth, or when it comes to being honest or giving accurate feedback, our natural tendency is to hold back. We'll speak in generalities, or we'll sugarcoat the information, anything, just to preserve the status quo so we don't have to have conflict. So often we just push it under the carpet. Unfortunately, though, when we do that, it comes back to haunt us later. The fact of the matter is that a lack of candor breeds mistrust. See, people know when you're not being truthful. People know when you're sugarcoating or when you're cushioning the information. And whilst they might not like to hear the truth, the fact is they deserve the truth. They have every right to hear your truth. Whether they agree or they disagree, well, that's not really the point here. They deserve to be respected with the truth, because the bottom line is this: if what your people are doing is no longer working, if they're no longer delivering the results that you expect, then it needs to change. But if they don't know, if they haven't come to the self-awareness that what they're doing is not working, then they won't change. And so therefore, from a people management perspective, we need to be very clear in our communication as to what's not working. We must be able to clearly demonstrate the gap between where they are right now and where they need to be in terms of their performance. See, when we tell it like it is, as hard as that is sometimes to deliver, and as hard as it is to receive, it actually promotes trust. Look, there's no question that as leaders we often have to do the things that people don't want to do. And unfortunately, there are times when we have to tell people the truth, whether they want to hear it or not, or whether we like to tell it or not. We have to step into the ring, take it on the chin, and deliver the feedback as we see important. Because if we don't, then if we're not candid with our people, they live in delusion, they live in fantasy land. You cannot build a strong business foundation, strong relationships with your people on sandy ground. You can't build a strong relationship on weak foundations. It's impossible. Because where there's a lack of candor, it's just fluff and puff. You're building your relationship on quicksand. The foundations have no strength, and sooner or later, your team and everything that you've been trying to do with them is just going to crumble. Let me say this, though. I've been leading up to this point. And that is, just because you may value candor and telling the truth doesn't mean to say that you can now go out and say whatever you need to say. Because the fact is, candor means saying what needs to be said, but saying it with respect for the other person. And this means you have to uphold their self-esteem. So as many Eastern philosophies would say, you have to help them save face. You can't just go about being blunt with people under the guise of, I'm telling the truth. You've got to position your feedback in such a way that it helps the individual to save face. Folks, let's face it, there's a big difference between being candid and being rude. So when it comes to delivering feedback then, we really need to use our very best judgment when considering and when delivering our feedback. I mean, if you think about it, how often have you given feedback just by shooting from the hip? You know, there are times we say stuff and we throw stuff out there and we even know the damage that we're causing. Folks, you've got to use good judgment. If you're going to say it, you need to say it with all due respect. That means we need to language our feedback in such a way that it allows the other person to protect their self-worth. Why? Well, let me ask you a question. Do you want your people focused on you and on your delivery as opposed to your message? Because if they're focused on your delivery, because you've just shot from the hip, because you've just put it out there without any thought as to how it's going to be received, then they're going to be focused on your delivery rather than on their own behavior. And then what do you think the chances of them changing are? Virtually none. They'll focus on you. They'll focus on what you said and how you said it and the way that you said it, but they won't actually focus on the meaning. They won't really focus on what they really need to take from your feedback and go about changing their behavior. And they will focus on you if you deliver your feedback in such a way that it causes them any emotional damage. The fact is that being candid or candor actually takes self-esteem, as we've said earlier. You have to be really confident with yourself if you're going to be candid and deliver truthful information. One needs self-confidence to deliver candid feedback. You have to know yourself, you have to believe in yourself, and you have to believe in what's right. And you've got to put your best foot forward. Because being candid and putting it out there also means that you also have to be in a position where you're probably going to have to receive. Because, folks, just because you put it out there doesn't mean to say that you're not going to get it back with the same amount of vengeance. You need to remember the principle of silence and violence here. Only if you're strong and secure in yourself will you be open to the feedback that may very well come back to you. You must have the internal strength to take on and listen to and be open to the feedback that might, as I say, very well come back to you. See, one of the biggest problems in giving feedback in a business environment is that people often just rely on their position power. And let's face it, positions themselves do have power. If you're driving down the road and all of a sudden you see a blue and white and red flashing light, what immediately happens? You see the uniform, and the uniform carries with it power. It's not the person, it's the uniform. It's the archetype of that person that carries the power. The uniform is reflective of that individual's position, and therefore the position carries the weight, not necessarily the individual. And let's face it, certain people and certain positions have a certain power base on which they operate from. It's very easy to go to some low-level positions in an organization and give that individual feedback. It's a whole different ballgame when you've got to go to the president of the organization or the chairman of the board and deliver feedback to them. Why? Because we're somewhat intimidated of their position. Often it's not the individual that we are intimidated by, it's their position. That's what engenders the intimidation. The fact is, everybody, no matter who it is, has someone or some role of some person that would intimidate them. Just think about a top person in business and think about that person standing in front of the President of the United States. There is going to be a level of intimidation because of the position power that that individual holds. We all have different self-esteems when it comes to different people. Whereas some people might not fear that position or that person, others do. Right now, if you think about it, how many of you know someone that it doesn't matter what they say to you, it'll just bounce right off you and you won't feel a thing? Yet there are others out there that you know that if they said something to you, if they gave you direct feedback, if they pushed your buttons, that feedback has the potential to send you into an emotional roller coaster ride. The more your self-esteem is intact, the more you're willing to step into the fray with no matter whom. So next time when it comes to you having to deliver feedback and you have a knot in your stomach, there's some fear there, there's some intimidation there, just recognize it for really what it is. There is an element of self-esteem, or in some cases the lack of self-esteem, that is creating the fight or flight response within you. So really the good news is that you get an opportunity to stretch your comfort zone and grow your self-esteem every time you have to give feedback to somebody where you feel that sense of fear or intimidation. And so you need to push yourself. You need to push your self-esteem, because that's where self-esteem is developed, and you in fact develop that by strengthening and pushing your comfort zone. So part of giving feedback is that you need to step into the fray, step into the ring, and do and say what needs to be done, no matter how tough it is to do. All right, so let's take a look at how we go about giving good feedback. So you'll recall in our last web clinic where we were looking at motivation, we said that when it came to delivering performance feedback, one of the best ways was really to take the heat off yourself, and in fact off the person you're actually giving the feedback to. And the best way to do that was to make your feedback about the role and not the individual. Do you remember that? So you'll recall we said that every role has certain key performance indicators. It has certain behavioral standards. It has certain output requirements that need to be delivered for that role to exist. And we also said that the role itself must adhere to those requirements. And you recall we said that when you make your feedback, your performance feedback about the role or about the box rather than the individual, then your feedback isn't personal. And so you take the individual out the box, and in taking them out of the box becomes just a role with certain outputs, inputs, and standards that the role itself, the box, must adhere to. And as we said, the only time things get then taken personally is when we put an individual inside that box and we start to try to manage the person rather than the outputs or the outcomes required of that box. Because if it's about the role, then really it can't be personal. The fact is, yes, the individual is managing the role, and the chances are they're not managing their role to standard, but it's the role itself that's not delivering. So what we're talking about here is really a subtle separation, that when you get it, and when you're easily able to present this picture to an individual, it really takes a tremendous amount of heat out of the kitchen, because now you're making it no longer personal. It's not about them. It's about the role which isn't delivering the standard, the KPI, etc. So let me give you a role play type example. So dialogue would kind of go like this. John, the role that you're in charge of is called a sales consultant, and it needs to deliver $300,000 every month. That's the requirement for the existence of this role within our organization. Now, John, here's my concern. My concern is because the role that you're managing is not delivering what it's supposed to, my role can't deliver what it's supposed to. And the sales team as a whole can't deliver what it's supposed to in order to deliver on its required sales targets. So let me hear from you, John. What do you think is going on here? Why do you think that the role itself isn't delivering the $300,000 that it needs to in order to exist? Now, do you notice in that example, in that role play, how the dialogue made it about the role? We were never talking about John. It was never personal. And this is a really critical principle to understand about the process of feedback, is that we make it about the behavior, we make it about the event, we make it about the issue at hand, never about the person. So even when little Johnny spills his chocolate sundae all over your beautiful white tablecloth, it's not Johnny who's clumsy. Johnny was just acting out clumsy behavior. It's never Johnny, you're stupid. It's Johnny, that was a stupid thing to do. It's not about Johnny, it's about the thing that Johnny did. There's a difference, but that subtle difference is the difference that makes it about the individual, where their self-esteem takes a hit, or where it just becomes about the event and how do we now go about cleaning up the mess. And by the way, let me say this, if somebody does make it personal, you can always then turn around to them and explain to them again, John, this is just about the role. It's about the role delivering its outputs. This is not personal. Let's not make it personal. Let's just talk about how we get this role to deliver its required outputs. So even if someone starts crying, again, you can say to that person, John, this is not personal. Don't make it personal. This is just about you and I figuring out what do we need to do to get this role happening again. What strategies do we need to come up with so that this role can start to hit its sales targets? So with that as a foundation, we're now going to give you 11 core principles to follow when it comes to delivering feedback. And then I'm going to walk you through a 7-step process for actually delivering feedback in such a way that you actually get the traction, you actually get the behavioral shift that you're looking for without upsetting the apple cart. I'm also going to show you a process that you can use. It's a process we call CPR that you can use when dysfunctional behavior keeps repeating itself over and over again. So you've given the feedback and you find yourself just having to deliver it over and over again. And the last thing we'll do today is take a look at those things that we need to do in order to receive feedback. Because it's one thing to know how to give it, it's quite another to know how to receive it. Alright, so the first principle we want to take a look at is critical to you delivering effective feedback. And what it is your preparation prior to the delivery. So here we talk about the 7 P's. Proper prior preparation prevents pitiful poor performance. And this axiom definitely applies when it comes to delivering accurate feedback successfully. And this really leads us to the second principle that you need to adopt to avoid just shooting from the hip and giving feedback that way. So the second principle is you need to examine your intent. So what is your intention here when you're delivering the feedback? Are you hoping to change behavior? Are you hoping to score points? Are you hoping to deliver a knockout blow? Do you have an agenda? Are you trying to get rid of the individual? What's your agenda? What is your intention? Here's the thing. The clearer your intent, the more effective your outcome. Because with a clear intent, you know exactly what you're shooting for. Then principle number 3, are your own emotions under control? You see, folks, often when we are giving feedback by just shooting from the hip, we're in an emotional loop, we're in an emotional vice, and so consequently, our words and our expressions and the content that comes out of our mouths is such that often we wish we could push it straight back. Unfortunately, however, once something has been said, it's been said, and this often causes a silence or a violent reaction, where now we've become the focus of their attention and not the behavior that we were hoping to change. Principle number 4 is clarity. When we're going to be providing feedback, we really need to be very clear about what it is specifically that we want to say. So the clearer your message, the more likely you'll get through to the person on the other side. So by way of an example, if you dialed my mobile phone and you got just one of those digits wrong, you could dial from now until eternity and you're never likely to get hold of me because your means of delivery is dysfunctional. There's a certain amount of digits that you must dial and they must be in sequence in order to reach me on my phone. There's a syntax, there's a sequence that you must deliver in your feedback if you want to get your message to have an impact and get traction. And we'll cover that sequence in the 6 steps in just a moment. Principle number 5. You need to focus on the behavior rather than your interpretation of that behavior. So you'll recall this is really the same principle as you focusing on the box, on the job role. What we're saying here is that you need to focus on the behavior itself, not your judgment, not your interpretation, not your own translation of what you think that behavior was all about. You see, it's not about what you think their intent was, because let's face it, most people's intent is really to do the right thing. Maybe the way they go about it could be wrong, but what we want to examine here is the way they're going about it rather than our interpretation of their motives. So if we interpret their intention as destructive, then our feedback is going to be very different to if we didn't interpret the intention at all and we just focused on the behavior. What are the things we need to change? What you're really trying to do here is you're trying to see the behavior for what it is, not for maybe how we are conditioned to see it. Number 6 is a powerful principle that you really need to take on board, and this is why preparation is really so important. And number 6 asks a question: do you have specific examples of the behavior that you wish to provide feedback for? As Charlie Tremendous Jones used to say, you need to be specific to be terrific. The better your examples that you can give the individual, the clearer your examples, the more cut through you're going to get. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. I'll pose 2 scenarios. Sometimes I get feedback from you guys saying, Ian, that was a really great web clinic. On the other hand, I've also had feedback to say, Ian, I really like the way you include real-life examples into the web clinic because it makes it more real. Okay, so now if you were me, which feedback would you prefer? Would you want feedback which was more generic? Hey, that was a really great web clinic. Or would you want the more specific feedback, which talks about giving examples? The more specific examples, the more cut through you're going to get. So the take home from this is, the more specific you can get, the more examples you can provide in your feedback, the greater the cut through you're going to get. The greater the cut through, the greater the traction you'll get with your feedback. Number 7, choosing your time and place. Folks, I can't begin to tell you how important it is that if you're going to deliver your feedback, you need to deliver it in an environment where it can be received and accepted. If you're going to deliver behavioral change feedback in a crowd, you stand absolutely no hope in getting cut through. You don't stand a hope in Hades. You've got to deliver it one-on-one in an environment where the individual is able to hear you without being emotionally caught up in their environment. So let's take a look at principle number 8. And principle number 8 asks, are your ears open and ready to receive? So what do we mean by this? Well, if you're going to give it, you've also got to be able to take it. And when we say take it, what we're really talking about here is truly listening to where that person is coming from. Really trying to understand what is going on the other side of the table. So, to give you an idea, one of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves is, what is it that makes them think that their behavior is okay? What makes them think it's okay to go month in, month out without hitting their numbers? I mean, think about it. Where did they get that idea from? Where would they get the idea that it's okay? I mean, isn't that fascinating? Just remember, this feedback is about them. It's not about you and about what you're feeling. Because yes, as much as we want to give them the feedback in terms of their behavior, we also really want to try and understand them. We want to try and understand what goes on inside their head. I mean, isn't this fascinating to you? So if you focused on what's fascinating, really trying to understand their point of view as opposed to getting angry and emotional and making this about you, as opposed to really trying to get inside their head and find out what it is that makes them think the way they think. And so with this understanding of how things can suddenly get out of hand and suddenly the focus is on you, you really need to mentally prepare yourself prior to the feedback intervention. And so the way that we do this is prior to the actual feedback session itself, when we're preparing, we give ourselves the affirmation, I intend to really listen. I'm going to listen with my head, I'm going to listen with my heart, and I'm going to listen with my eyes. I'm going to watch their body language. I'm going to read between the lines. And if you do this, this will set you up for a really positive feedback experience. Then principle number 9 is the age-old principle of empathy. So let's walk in their shoes. If you're really going to listen to them, then we really need to listen with empathy. We need to walk in their shoes. What's it like to be them? What's it like to think the way they think? To show empathy is to identify with another's feelings. Folks, think about it this way. You're about to really give somebody a serve. You're about to potentially wound another human being. In other words, what you want to do here is you want to emotionally put yourself in their place. Because empathy begins with an awareness of the other person's feelings. It's really to emotionally put yourself in the place of another. The more you can be aware of where they're at emotionally, the more you can very quickly head off any situation that might get out of control. And so what we do here is we have a technique which we call an emotional read. And here we're talking about principle number 10, the emotional read. Being willing to read their emotion and tell them what you think they are emoting at that point. Okay, so what is an emotional read? Well, let's say you're sitting there and you can see the individual starting to get all hot under the collar. You can see their blood pressure starting to increase. You can see their breathing start to get shallow. You can see they're really starting to boil. Well, this is an opportunity for you to call it. Call the information as you read it. So you might say something like, Mary, I get the sense that you're really uncomfortable about this. Is that right? And the fact is, it doesn't matter what word you use. You could have said, I get the sense you're really angry about what it is we're talking about. Is that right? It doesn't matter the emotional term you use, because believe me, if you're wrong, they'll very quickly correct you. What you want to do here is, you want to get them talking about that emotion. So if they're angry, let it come out. It's far better that it comes out before it boils up and just vomits out on the table. So they might turn around and say, well, the truth is, I'm not uncomfortable. I'm just really angry. So, okay, John, well, let's talk about that. What's getting you so riled up right now? Now that it's on the table, you've got an opportunity to talk. And remember, an emotional read is just a read. It doesn't matter whether you read it right or whether you read it wrong, as long as you just express what you've read. So here's another example. Let's say you're giving feedback to Mary, and she's going silent. She's just getting more and more withdrawn. So you do an emotional read. Mary, I can see that you seem to be really upset. No, I'm not upset. I'm just really disappointed. Okay, disappointed. Disappointed in what, Mary? Disappointed in who? Now is the opportunity. Let's talk about the emotion that's going on here. Here's the opportunity. Let's talk about the emotion. Let's get it on the table. This is what we call an emotional read. It doesn't matter whether you read it right or whether you read it wrong. Just by virtue of you saying what you think you've read, that's enough to get the emotion out on the table that you can deal with it. Because you're going to deal with it anyway. It's far better to deal with it in a way where it's still controllable than when it's out of control. Now, principle number 11 is what we call understanding the blind spot, understanding the Johari window. So what exactly is the Johari window? And some of you may already have been exposed to the Johari window model at some time in your career, and there have been many iterations, but basically they all kind of lead towards the same thing. So the Johari window was developed in 1955 and was named after the names of its inventors, a fellow by the name of Joseph Luft and Harry Ingham, hence the Johari or Johari. And it's regarded still today as one of the most useful models to describe the process of human interaction. And I'm just going through the Johari window here with you, not so that you can become an expert in using the model, but so that you can understand what goes on with people, and it just helps to add that extra dimension to your feedback. So, like many other behavioral models, the Johari window is actually based on a 4-square grid. So there's 4 quadrants. And these 4 quadrants form what we call the public self, the private self or the hidden self, the blind self, and the unknown or undiscovered self. So let's talk about the public self first. So in this quadrant, this is what I see in me and what you see in me. You see, in this quadrant, you typically don't mind discussing with others this part of you. And in fact, most of the time, you actually agree with this view that you have and that others have of you. And what we say of this quadrant, it's what is known by the person about him or herself that is also known by others. And it's known as the public self, or in more technical terms, the open arena, or just the arena. In the second area, which is what I see in me and what you don't see in me, this is what we call our private or our hidden self. And this is what you see in yourself but others don't. In this part of you, you hide things that are very private about yourself. So this is information that you don't want exposed, you don't want it disclosed for your own personal protection. Maybe it's information that you're ashamed of, Maybe it's an area of vulnerability that you feel you have weaknesses in or faults in, or just general dysfunctional areas that you don't want exposed. And by the way, this area equally applies to your good qualities that you don't want to advertise to the world due to your own personal modesty. And we say this of this quadrant: it is what the person knows about him or herself that others don't know. And in technical terms, it's known as the hidden area or the facade. And then we have the blind self. And this is what you don't see in yourself, but others see in you. So you might see yourself as an open-minded person, where in reality people around you consider you to be kind of an anal type personality. And this works the other way too. You might see yourself as, let's say, really dumb, while others might consider you to be incredibly clever or bright. Now here's the thing. Sometimes people around you might not tell you what they see because they're scared of you. So they have fear around offending you, or they might just consider it a waste of time talking to you because you're not going to do anything about it anyway. And it's in this area that people detect that your walk and your talk don't exactly match. And oftentimes one's body language actually shows up this mismatch. And we say of this quadrant, it's what is unknown by the person about himself or herself, but that others know. And technically this area is called the blind area, the blind self, or simply the blind spot. And this is really what I don't see in me, but what you do see in me. And then the final quadrant is what we call the undiscovered or unknown self. And it's the self that you cannot see, nor can others around you. In this category, there might be some good and bad things that are out of the awareness of both yourself and others. And so what we say of this quadrant is what is unknown by the person about him or herself, as well as what is also unknown by others. So these are parts of us that we don't know, and neither do others. And this is called the unknown area or the unknown self. And so with that in mind, you can see how the Johari window can be a very helpful tool in understanding the feedback model. Because when you think about giving people feedback, we want to make sure that what we're doing is we're helping them to shrink down their blind spot. So this is shrinking down the area that people don't know or don't have any awareness within themselves. And so that really the whole idea here is that you're bringing into somebody's awareness areas of their behavior, areas of their thinking, areas of their communication that they may well be not aware of because it's in their blind spot. So that now you've at least made them aware, and then they can get into the process of developing that area that is dysfunctional and potentially holding them back. Okay, so to summarize the Johari window, the key principle is that people only see what they see. People only hear what they hear. People are guided by their own perceptions. And therefore, the whole goal of feedback then is to get people to see what they don't see, is to open up that blind spot so that they can have awareness of their behavior, of their thinking, of their communication, of that dysfunction. Because once they understand what it is they're not seeing and they get it, only then does the behavior start to shift, and the behavior now begins to change. All right then, so keeping these principles in mind, let's dive in and let's take a look at the 7 specific steps that we want to take if you're going to deliver feedback effectively. All right, so step number 1, preparation. The 7 P's. Proper prior preparation prevents pitiful poor performance. If their performance is worth changing, then it's worthwhile preparing for. We know that shooting off from the hip is just disastrous. You need to think about what you're going to say, and you need to prepare. Take the 7-point checklist that you have in your notes. Put it out in front of you. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Which leads us into step 2, which is the discussion about the discussion. And in this discussion, we actually talk to them about silence and violence. So you need to prepare yourself, as well as you also need to prepare the individual you're going to give feedback to for the prospect of a silent or a violent reaction. So you need to let them know that they're about to get some feedback which may not be positive and that could result in a negative reaction. You need to tell them that in some cases people go silent, in which case they themselves might withdraw and go all internal, and in other cases people actually get quite violent. They get quite aggro, and when they get angry they might point fingers, they might storm off in a huff. So just let them know that should that happen, or should you start to sense or see a reaction like that, you're just going to call a timeout in order for them to collect themselves so that you can get back to the business at hand. So if you have the discussion about the discussion, if you bring this up ahead of time, it allows you to tackle the issue when it comes across the table. Step number 3 is you need to be specific. When we talk about being specific, it's easy to turn around to somebody and tell them that their work is sloppy or not up to standard. Or even that, John, I'm really disappointed you're not hitting your numbers. Because when it comes to being specific, the details count. You want to make sure you're really being specific in terms of the feedback that you're presenting. So as an example, you might say, well, John, what I was expecting to see by now was that the average length of time that it took you to bring a customer through the pipeline would have come down from 120 days down to 60 days. And what our pipeline report is telling us is that, in fact, your average length of time is actually 160 days. You can see then how this example differs from just telling somebody that you're disappointed because their pipeline is just running too long. So step number 3 then is be specific. Now step number 4 incorporates the Johari window, and we call step number 4 describing the gap. So in this step what we do is we explain to them how we see it. We explain to them the gap between their current performance and the performance you're looking for, and then we ask them how they see it. The idea here is you're going to explain to them how it looks to you, and it being the behavior or the dysfunction or the gap between what they're doing currently and what you want them to do. And it might sound something like, so John, let me tell you what's worrying me, and then I'd like to hear your take on it. So you're going to put it out there, but you also want to get their input. So step number 4 is really made up of 2 parts. Part 1 is explaining the gap, and part 2 is getting their input as to how they see the gap. The whole idea being that they come to see the gap between their current performance and the performance that you're talking about. Step number 5 is you need to stay focused on the facts. Folks, you've got to give specific examples. If you want to get traction, you really need to give them examples, because examples tell the story. Examples help to open up their mind, help them to see what you see. So by way of an example, so John, let's see if we can agree on the problem. I need you to shrink your sales pipeline down to the required 120 days. And what you're saying is you can't do that because the particular projects you have in your pipeline are with companies that have a really convoluted decision-making system. Is that how you see it? So step number 5 is staying focused on the facts. And step number 6 is pretty straightforward. Step number 6 says develop an action plan. So here what you're doing is, together you're coming up with a plan of action that they can go forth and implement so that they can get the change that you're looking for. And then step number 7 is you setting a time to review the outcome. So here what we're talking about is you are closing the sale. You are setting a time to review the change in behaviors. You're setting aside the time to review the outcomes of their work effort. I mean, if you think about it, over the years, how many performance appraisals have you sat in? How many performance appraisals have you done? And how many performance appraisals really, when you've been given feedback, or when you've even given feedback, we've simply just gone through the motions, we've filled out the paperwork, and then it goes straight into the drawer to be forgotten about for another year. Folks, if you're giving feedback, you can't forget about it. If you want to change behavior, it takes time. It takes coaching. You've got to put it on your coaching agenda. You've got to work at it. You've got to talk about it. You've got to put it out there in the open. You've got to follow it up, follow it up, follow it up. And you have to set aside time to come back and review performance. That's how they know it's important. And that's what creates the behavioral change from your feedback. Folks, there are many other feedback models out there, but what I've found is that these 7 steps are easy to use, they're pretty easy to remember, and with a little bit of practice and regular use, you'll get them down, and as a result, you'll start to get the traction, the change in behavior that you're looking for. All right, so I told you today was going to be a long one. There's just a couple more things I want to cover, and this is really, really important. So folks, here's a question that burns most people when it comes to giving feedback. What do you do when it's Groundhog Day? So what do you do when the dysfunctional behavior just keeps on repeating itself over and over again? So you've given the corrective feedback, and yet the same thing just keeps happening over and over again. Same message, same situation, still no behavioral change. What do you do? Now let's face it. You're getting more and more frustrated. The person that you're giving the feedback to is getting more and more frustrated. You sound more and more like a nag. And to them, it just feels like you're on their back all the time. You're just not getting anywhere. How do you change this? How do you move things forward? Well, there's a really terrific technique that I discovered in a book called Crucial Conversations. And the technique is called CPR. By the way, the book is a really worthwhile read. Actually, there are a couple of them. One is called Crucial Conversations, and the other is called Crucial Confrontations. And both of these books have terrific practical tools and processes that they use. And the one that we're going to talk about today is called CPR, which is used to overcome this whole Groundhog Day scenario. And probably the best way for me to describe the CPR technique is to use an example. Okay, so let's take an example of Billy coming in late. And all due respect to the Billies out there, but Billy comes in late. You notice that whenever you have a sales meeting, Billy is always 10 to 15 minutes late. He always disrupts the meeting, and it takes time for the meeting to settle down again. Plus, you're getting grumblings from the rest of the team. How come Billy always gets away with it? Why don't you call Billy out on his always coming late? Why does he get away with it? Why don't we? People make snide remarks to Billy because they see he comes late and he always tends to get away with it. And even though you've given Billy the feedback, you've told him that his behavior is dysfunctional and it's having a negative impact on the team, you've given him the feedback and you've told him that he needs to change his performance, yet still Billy comes in late. What do you do? Okay, so there's the scenario. So now let's apply the CPR technique to the situation. First of all, the C in the CPR process stands for content. Now the content in this example is Billy's coming late. Now in the example I've just described, we've already had the content discussion. We've spoken to Billy on at least 3 occasions, possibly more, about his tardiness, about him coming late to meetings. There is no point in having this conversation anymore because you've already had it. What we now need to do is we now need to escalate the conversation to P, which stands for pattern. What's the pattern here? So now when you're having a conversation with Billy, we're no longer talking to Billy about his coming late. We're now going to talk about the pattern that you've noticed. So, Billy, I've noticed that there's a pattern here. And the pattern basically is whenever we have a sales meeting, you're always showing up 10 to 15 minutes late. And even though we've spoken about this on numerous occasions, your behavior still hasn't changed. And I'm wanting to figure out how we can actually move beyond this, because there's a pattern here, and it's a dysfunctional pattern, and it's a pattern that must change. So what do we need to do? How do we go about addressing that? So you notice now we're talking about a pattern, which is a very different type of conversation. Now all of a sudden we're no longer nagging Billy because we're actually having a completely different discussion. If for whatever reason after our pattern discussion the behavior still doesn't change and Billy still keeps coming in late, then we escalate the conversation to R. And the R in the CPR model stands for relationship. Now let's think about relationship for a moment. What are the fundamentals of a successful relationship? Folks, I'm sure you all agree that a fundamental value of a successful relationship is trust and respect. Without trust, without respect, you really can't have a successful relationship. So if you've asked Billy to do something, to get to the meetings on time, and he's agreed that he will come to the meetings on time, here's a question for you. Has he or has he not violated his commitment to you? And therefore, if he is in breach of his commitment to you, doesn't that actually mean that he's in breach of the relationship? Doesn't that mean that he has violated the trust and respect in the relationship? So now you have a completely different conversation with Billy about the relationship, and the conversation will go something like this. Billy, I'd like to talk to you because my concern is I can't trust you anymore. What do you mean you can't trust me, boss? Well, you know what, Billy? I like to take people for their word, and you've given me your word on a number of occasions, and the truth is you keep breaking it, so I just can't trust you. To me, it just seems like a lack of respect. So if I can't trust you, and I don't feel that you have any respect for me, then you tell me, where do we go from here? You see how the conversation is very different. We're not talking about content anymore. We're not talking about Billy coming late. We're not even talking about the pattern of him coming late. It's now a relationship issue. When you take your discussion down to a relationship level, this is where you'll see a shift in behavior. And by the way, it's not just in the workplace. Think about it at home. So as an example, I've got kids who struggle to get their plates in the dishwasher. For whatever reason, they find it that much easier just to take their dishes and put them in the sink. Now, over and over and over, I've said, put your plates in the dishwasher. Doesn't happen. Well, eventually I got tired of having that discussion. So we then had the pattern discussion. Kids, I've noticed that there's a pattern here. I've asked you to put your stuff in the dishwasher, and for whatever reason, you choose to disregard me. You keep putting your dishes in the sink. When we've had this conversation, we've had this discussion on numerous occasions. What do we need to do to break this cycle? What do we need to do to change the pattern? You see, that's a different discussion. So now, in the case of one of my children, the dysfunctional behavior continued. And his dishes still found their way to the sink. Well, it was time for me to have a different discussion. It was time for me to have the relationship discussion. And this discussion went something like, you know what, son? This is a really hard conversation for me to have with you, because I feel like my trust in you is slowly being eroded. What do you mean, Dad? Well, you know what? You've made numerous commitments to me. You've promised that you'll put your stuff in the dishwasher, and you don't. Now, I know that's just a small thing, but to me, it's actually a big thing, because you've broken that promise on numerous occasions. And if you're breaking your promise and your commitment to me on such a small thing, how do I know you're going to keep it when there's something that's even bigger? Can you see how this is a very different discussion? As the complexity of the discussion changes, so you get to the heart of the matter. And so you move people out of that whole Groundhog Day scenario. And this is how you get a shift. This is how you drive change. All right, so as we start to wrap up today's session, I want to take a look at what we call the Baker's Dozen. The 13 key points that we need to understand if we really want to make sure that we effect a positive rather than a negative outcome. And so when it comes to feedback, we know that your feedback will be ineffective or negatively perceived when, number one, when we play games with people, when we have an agenda, when we are trying to manipulate people. Number two, when we're attacking, when we come across as hard-hitting and aggressive, and we focusing on the weaknesses of the individual. Number three, when our feedback is indirect. So our feedback is vague, we kind of hint at issues rather than addressing them firmly and directly on the nose. And number four is when your feedback focuses on the personality of the individual rather than on their behavior. So it's a bit like saying to someone, you have a bad attitude. Well, really, the response you're likely to get to a statement like that is, well, what's wrong with my attitude? I don't think I have a bad attitude. What do you mean I have a bad attitude? You see, what you really want to do here is you want to describe what you see as the bad attitude behaviors rather than point a finger at their personality saying that they have a bad attitude. What is the negative behavior that is showing up? That's what you need to point to. Number five, we're insensitive. So in our feedback, we show little concern for the needs of the other person. Number six, we're disrespectful. Our feedback is demanding, and in some cases bordering on insulting. We need to be considerate. Our feedback should not be intended to insult or to demean. Number seven, a big one. Our feedback is judgmental. Feedback that is evaluative or judging the personality rather than the behavior. This is what puts people's back up. Our feedback is too general. This means it's aimed at broad issues which are really hard to be nailed down or easily defined. Poor timing. So our feedback is given far too long after the prompting event. And number 10, which is the other half of poor timing, and we call this impulsive feedback. So this is really times where we dish out our feedback rather thoughtlessly, without any regard given to the appropriateness of the time and the place. Number 11, our feedback is selfish. The feedback meets our needs as the giver rather than the needs of the individual. 12, our feedback is unsupportive, so it's delivered in a threatening and discouraging manner. And finally, number 13, our feedback really isn't helpful. Feedback should be intended to be of value to the individual. So there's the baker's dozen, the 13 points that will have a negative impact on your feedback delivery. And then finally today, I want to talk about receiving feedback. So how many of you have heard the proverb, "Don't look a gift horse in the mouth"? But more importantly, how many of you actually know what that proverb actually means or where it comes from? Folks, many years ago, when we used to use horses as our major mode of transportation, the way you would check a horse's age was to look at its teeth. So let's say way back then you were given a gift, and you were given the gift of a horse. Would you stand in front of the person who's just given you this expensive present and immediately go and look at the horse's teeth? No, you wouldn't, because that would totally disparage the gift. It's a bit like when somebody gives you a box of chocolates for a present and you say, "Thank you very much, but I really don't like marzipan." Well, essentially, you've just dismissed the whole gift. So when somebody gives you feedback, you need to be able to take that feedback on as though someone has given you a gift. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. So the key to receiving feedback is not to try and justify your position. You just need to accept the feedback at face value and just say thank you. So let me share a personal example of what I'm talking about. A few weeks ago, after conducting a web clinic like this, I was given some feedback by one of the personal implementation coaches about some of the lessons that he thought I'd done particularly well. And so rather than actually thanking him for his positive feedback, I went on to start justifying why I'd done certain things, why I said this or why I said that, and actually became quite defensive about the whole thing. And then he called me out. He said, "Ian, why don't you just say thank you?" And I got it. Yes, he was giving me positive feedback, and there I was justifying my position. And in fact, since then, we've had other opportunities where he's given me the feedback, and so now I say thank you, and I just allow the feedback just to kind of wash over me and make me feel good. The key when receiving feedback is to evaluate the feedback before responding. So just stop and think about the feedback before you respond. Hey, folks, if the feedback doesn't sit, if the feedback doesn't suit, or if the cap doesn't fit and you're not happy with the feedback, well, that's okay. No need to chuck your toys out of the cot. Don't lose your temper. Remember, the person is giving you the feedback. They're showing you from their perspective what may be a blind spot for you. Another thing is, don't ruminate on the feedback. Don't dwell on it and think about it day in and day out. Rather, just make a decision. Are you going to use that feedback or aren't you? If you are going to use it, how are you going to use it to move yourself forward? And then simply choose how you're going to use that feedback to make yourself better. Folks, that's how you receive feedback. All right, so let me quickly summarize just the key points of today's session, and I'll let you go because it's been a long haul today, I know. Point number one, effective feedback is specific. It's not general. And what we mean by this is we say, the report you turned in yesterday was well written, easy to understand, and you made your points about the budget very effectively. Don't just say, great report. We also said that effective feedback always focuses on a specific behavior and not a person or their intentions. Folks, the very best feedback is feedback that is sincere and that's honestly provided to help. People will know if they're receiving the feedback for any other reason. Successful feedback describes actions or behaviors that the individual can do something about. Whenever possible, feedback that is requested is far more powerful. So ask permission to provide feedback. Say, "John, Mary, I'd like to give you some feedback about your presentation. Is that okay with you?" And then the moment they say yes, that opens the door for you to give feedback, and that means that there's a better chance of them actually willing to receive that feedback. Effective feedback involves the sharing of information and observations. It doesn't include advice unless you have permission or unless the advice was requested. Make sure if you're going to give advice, you get permission. Effective feedback is well timed. Whether the feedback is positive or constructive, provide the information as closely tied to the event as possible. We also know that effective feedback involves what or how something was done, not why it was done. Asking why is asking people about their motivation, is asking people about their intention. And that's what actually provokes defensiveness. Check in to make sure that the person has understood what you communicated by using a feedback loop, such as asking a question or observing a changed behavior in your follow-up sessions. Finally, your feedback must be consistent. If the actions are great today, they'll be great tomorrow. If the policy violation merits discipline, it should always merit discipline. The key is when you see poor behavior, you have to call it. If you let it slide, if you let people get away with it, you teach them by virtue of you not doing anything that their behavior is okay. So what's your action plan? What are you going to do as a result of today's web clinic? Well, the answer is simple. Here's the activity. I want you to go out and practice the 7-step feedback model. Find 3 reasons to give 3 different people feedback using the model so that you can get a feel of it, so you can get a sense of how it works. And that's it. Folks, thank you for attending. I know it was a huge session today. We covered an awful lot of ground. This session was probably, as I said in the beginning, one of the most important sessions of our whole time together, because it's feedback in the moment. It's feedback that corrects behavior. It's the feedback that will help you to drive the result you're looking for. And just remember, it's what you do today that will ensure the success of your sales team tomorrow. Thank you very much. Cheerio.